Welcome to Fringe Pop, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. As part of our ongoing interview series, we have Dr. Judd Burton back with us. Judd, thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, because you might be new, to new viewers and whatnot, because, we get new viewers all the time. Just give us a brief introduction of who you are, what your degrees are in, and sort of, what your expertise is.
I'm primarily a classical historian. Greco-Roman history, early church is my area of specialty, but I'm also interested in the history of religions. I have a PhD in history with a focus in religion from Texas Tech, and I've also got training in anthropology. I've got a master's degree in anthropology with cultural experience and also archaeology.
Yeah, you taught anthropology for a while, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. Did you do World Civ as well, or was it just the
I've taught a little bit of everything. I've taught anthropology, archaeology, World Civ, humanities, mythology.
Okay, good. Well, today we thought we would do something really lightweight and non-controversial.
Yeah, right.
And that is, I asked Judd if he would talk a little bit about the history and folklore of witchcraft. So this is really a convoluted subject. I mean, we hear those terms now, and we might think of maybe Wicca, or if we're old enough, we would think of Bewitched, some TV show or whatever. But again, this could go in all sorts of different directions, and a lot of them, I'm pretty sure, that people today would not sort of immediately think of, like especially if you get back into biblical days, ancient Near Eastern material, that sort of thing. So let's try to start with something really basic.
Okay.
And we'll try to start early on. It doesn't have to be the biblical world, but it could be. It could be broader than that. But what's a witch? Okay, and what is witchcraft in light of that definition?
Well, I could give you the cliche academic
sort of. Let's start with
that's
that.
Such a debatable topic.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that it's not a difficult thing to pin down the definition. Yeah, you're going to have some cultural variation, but the fact of the matter is that there's a pretty solid anthropological definition for witch, and that is somebody who is generally operates anathema to whatever the cultural norm is in a given society, and practices magic, usually for malevolent ends. You might draw a distinguishing line between, let's say, a witch and a shaman. The shaman, if we're going back to prehistory, going back as early as we possibly can, you can look at the shaman as a kind of within the bounds of whatever the cultural norm is.
Right, someone would go to the shaman.
Right, exactly.
Not necessarily, hey, I don't like my neighbor, do something about that guy.
Right, exactly.
It could be something, much more positive.
Exactly. That would be the purview of witches and sorcerers, if we're looking at it, through the lens of anthropology. And that's a pretty standard, pretty perennial feature of witchcraft, or these two things, the use of magic, and generally for means counter to whatever the cultural norm is.
Describe for us what a magical worldview is, because this is something else that you'll run into. Usually, when some source is talking about, witches or introducing the subject, they'll make reference to, well, this is a person that does what they do in the context of a culture's magical worldview. So unwrap that a little bit.
Certainly. Well, a magical worldview is not just a supernatural worldview. It's the belief that those supernatural forces are manipulable to whatever ends the individual practitioner happens to have in mind. But that in general is a magical worldview, that there are supernatural forces, and again, it can run the spectrum. It runs the gamut of anywhere from those forces being something impersonal, like mana, sort of the catch-all term for an animating force, that you see in animism and totemism that we talked about in some of our last sessions, all the way to a more anthropomorphic kind of deity, like an Olympian-style god. In the case of totemism, these spirits are generally animals. Sometimes plants and geographical features, but usually animals. And so these forces not only influence, but can also, to a degree, be, manipulated and influenced.
Yeah, bartered with,
Exactly.
You reach some agreement with them.
Yeah,
there's
and that's a good analogy. I mean, it can be boiled down to a kind of economy of the spirit world.
Mm-hmm. I know, like in ancient Near Eastern, my field is ancient Near Eastern literature and biblical literature.
Mm-hmm.
You'll usually see the term used, again, pretty broadly, and it's almost, I'm going to say it this way, and then this will sort of reveal a suspicion that I have about it. But you can read introductions to this, and the answer to the question, what's a witch, will be, well, someone who is in contact with the spirits of the dead, or non-human spirits, so there's your contact dimension, or who cast spells with plants or whatever. What I'm getting at is here, it sounds suspiciously like Deuteronomy 18, and I don't know how legitimate that is, because what you're describing is wider than that, and so I suspect that just generally, when you get out of the biblical literature, those things are part of what one of these individuals would be, again, that we call a witch. But it's probably a little bigger than that. That we shouldn't sort of be defining the term through the filter, of the Old Testament. Because divination can be a very large
certainly,
category.
and you find it all over the globe, over space and time. But even the Old Testament references to witchcraft, they still fit nicely within the anthropological definition.
Well, unpack those a little bit. What's the difference between divination and, contacting a spirit for information, or do they overlap?
I would say that there's overlap there. You're still looking at in this case, the witch, our subject. You're still looking at somebody who's accessing, the spirit realm, and a lot of the contact, again, is defined by the culture that you find these individuals in. So it could be, disembodied spirits. It could be the more, human-like, anthropomorphic deities that they're contacting.
What do you think the difference is between someone that would get this label, a witch, as opposed to like a priestly figure? Because, you have priests, both within the Old Testament and outside, who will do divination things, whether it's reading a sheep's liver or the Urim and the Thummim, in the biblical context. But I don't think that anybody would really look at that and say, put that in the witch column. Okay, so like what do you think the difference would be?
Well, the priest is a steward of public religion in most cases, the public sphere. You have these overlapping spheres of religious ideologies that quite well, being a student of religion yourself, that you not only have public spheres, but you also have private spheres. By definition, by the very nature of the work that the witch is doing, they're generally operating within the private sphere.
It's like a religious black market.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's a really good description. And again, those examples in the Old Testament, I think line up nicely with those parameters.
Yeah, because I can think of different rituals, different texts, and whether it's Akkadian stuff or Ugaritic stuff, where a priest would be, in this case, contacting the dead or something like that. So that's a thing a priest would do, but like you said, there's sort of an official box that they play in. They might do things annually or weekly or monthly, or there's a short list of here's what we do. We don't play outside the box. We don't do this, that, or the other thing, and it creates that. Not only does it create the entrepreneurial category of someone who will play outside the box, but it sort of assumes it, like that there could be laws. I was just recently reading something in Hammurabi where about spellcasting. I mean, this is totally off the wall, but it reminds me of this since we're in this topic now, where here you have Hammurabi's law, and it doesn't, in this particular passage, it doesn't condemn some guy who had cast a spell on another guy, all right? but it says something like, well, if the guy that got the spell cast on him really did do this crime, and let's throw him in the water, it's one of these trial by ordeal things. And if he drowns, well, then he was guilty, so you own his house now. It was just this sort of taken for granted kind of thing, but it wasn't part of the official. Like, I wouldn't go to the neighborhood priest and ask him to put a spell on this guy because I think he stole something from me. You would use somebody else for that. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So how do you? I don't want to sound like the Wizard of Oz. Are there good witches and bad witches? I mean, I guess this is going to be culturally dependent too. But talk a little bit about that. This is something that I actually dealt with in my thesis, because I did a thesis on a neo-pagan congregation. Now, if you look at modern witchcraft, modern neo-paganism, which is something that I don't think would serve us too well to dwell on too long, because it's a topic that's been covered quite a bit. I mean, we can talk about it, certainly, but there certainly seems to be a moral relativism that runs through the modern neo-pagan movement, and so by their definition, their tendency is generally to be moral, as long as it doesn't hurt somebody. Again, there's a lot of leeway, that you can. How do you define that? Exactly. Yeah. But again, if you just look at the real basic essential metrics, you look at the basic features of witches around the world in different cultures over space and time, these core traits line up, and there are more of those than, let's say, defining a modern movement like Wicca, or modern Druidism or some other form of neo-paganism. There are more of these others where you have these practitioners who are operating completely opposite to what is the accepted cultural norm. So in very loose terms, I suppose you could say that there are good witches, but they're sort of following the rules of the guild or following the rules of the culture. Essentially. And the thing about neo-paganism is that it's hard to find a kind of the desire within the communities is to find a historical lineage, but they typically didn't keep written records, so it's almost impossible. You have to look at trial records and even archaeology can give us some clue. Yeah, and the trial records are going to be pretty biased. Yeah, exactly, completely slanted. One way or the other. It just seems to me, looking at the issue, that there are if you're going to use the term witch based on the most shared characteristics, then you're looking at somebody who is malevolent for the most part, and that's biblically congruent too. Going back to even I don't want to jump the gun here, but going back to some of the apocryphal literature like Enoch, I wrote a chapter in my book Interview with a Giant called the Primal Witch that traces this model that lines up with the anthropological model back to what the Watchers were teaching, early humans. Yeah, we'll have to. That's something I'd like to drill down on. Maybe in a give it its own episode. Sure. That's that sort of thing. But since you did mention that, I mean, you do get, and I'm sure we'll pick up this thread at some later point. But you do get, like the Apkallu, who are the Mesopotamian equivalents to the Watchers. They factor into something called the Maklu rituals, which is the Akkadian kind of like, what do you do with a witch? It's just like this whole series of incantations to either address witchcraft or undo something or punish, the practitioner or whatever. And they actually factor into that. So there is that connection even outside, the Bible, which is kind of interesting. So if a witch, again, predominantly is this person who sort of is outside the guild, outside the official sort of religious power structure, sort of operates alongside, again, the sanctioned authorities. Okay, if that's the case, just give us a quick, overview of what kinds of things might a person ask them to do.
Well, again, that's a wide berth there, but in places where laws, in a particular society wouldn't allow for, a perceived kind of justice. It's not uncommon to find individuals seeking these practitioners to try and level the playing field, so to speak, or get back at somebody.
I didn't like the decision of the court, so you do something about that.
And you do see that actually showing up in, during the witch craze in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. You do see, trying to think of the book. I think Guido Ruggiero is the author. He wrote a book called Binding Passions, and he looks at some of these, these neighborhood practitioners that people would go to, particularly women, because women didn't have access to the legal system.
To a lot of the legal system, yeah. I can see, contacting a lost, loved one or something. That would be
sure. All of those,
There's a lot of those practices in the official corridors would have been reserved for the elite in the culture. Well, the king can ask that question, or this other person that's pretty high up in the hierarchy, but it's not like the average person could just walk into the temple off the street and ask the priest to do X, Y, or Z. So it sort of lent itself to this thing on the periphery, again, that would necessarily not have been approved, but people knew that this person was there, and so that's interesting, I can see now why you would define it as sort of a malevolent, because typically, I think this is probably fair to say in terms of human nature, typically if you thought something wasn't going your way, like a court case or something in life, with a neighbor or a relative or whatever it was, you would want to either get even or get ahead. I mean, this is just sort of a human impulse, And so you would believe, in this worldview, you would be believing that, okay, well, chances are somebody who's operating in the official apparatus, who's accountable to the law, whatever the laws of the city or the culture might be, probably won't do this for me, either because I'm the low rung here on the social ladder or for other reasons. But there's this person down the street over here that would do that, and so that's where that malevolent feel comes from, just in the way people thought about it, and used it. So do you think that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
In the case of, and again, that however we want to gauge that malevolence, that sort of runs the gamut too. But in the case of the Dene, the Navajo, for instance, if you became a witch, and one of the names consequently for witch in the Navajo language, we translate as skinwalker. And we talked about the skinwalkers in the context of werewolves last time. But this was a shape-shifting witch, and they were considered to be the worst of the worst. They completely turned their back on their culture, to the point that, they still retain, of course, certain elements of language, whatnot, but they operate almost completely on the periphery of Dene society.
Well, that's interesting. Well, we'll pick up with some of these things when we chat again.
Okay.
A couple of roads that we want to go down, but thanks for visiting with us again.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website at fringepop321.com for information on this episode and other episodes that we've done. And if you want to support what we're doing here, please go to fp321.com/S as in Sam. That's fp321.com/S to support us. And thanks once again for watching, because what you know may not be so.